Welcome back to the What's More podcast. I'm your host, Quinton Harris. We are dialed in for episode 161. And so, hey, thanks to our audience members here. Thanks to the people that listen to this show. All the creative stuff you're putting back on our YouTube channel at What's Your One More. You guys have asked a question that I think just needs to be addressed. Hey, Quinton, what if rates don't drop? What if the economy doesn't recover? What if, the Federal Reserve decides to hike rates? In the last episode, we just talked about the Jerome Powell show and kind of broke down all the warning signs as to why they're going to cut rates. But I think that, in all fairness to our audience, maybe we should address that stuff. Maybe we should talk about that. So this episode is going to focus on a word called stagflation. And I mentioned in the last episode how Jerome Powell came, not unglued, but was kind of like, hey, I don't know where we're coming up with these words. Who in the media is pumping the word stagflation out there? But the definition of stagflation is when inflation hangs around and it doesn't go away. Like you can't counterbalance it. It doesn't get to the target rate, or it maybe rears its ugly head again, and then you have to keep fighting it. And stagflation is the death of an economy. There are multiple countries that you can point to and say, hey, they've had stagflation for quite some time, and they haven't been able to rebound from it. And if you're of the stagflation camp, this episode's for you, right? Because we're going to talk about what if inflation does come back and how can it come back? Well, first, how does that happen? Well, let's just assume that the Federal Reserve takes their foot off the restrictive gas. They've already started with it a little bit there with the elimination of the runoff. They still have some, but it's not as great as it was. So they're going to start buying treasuries again. And essentially, if they lower the Fed funds rate, that would bring more liquidity back into the market, just like what they're doing on the side of the balance sheet. Putting liquidity in the market is essentially feeding the inflation animal, if you may, because the reason we got to inflation is we had too much in the system, right? And so we've been able to kind of curb it down. But if you start pumping more back in, you might not have done enough, if you may, to prevent it from going back up again. And so people in the stagflation camp believe, once the Federal Reserve gets to an easing policy, a lot of people believe it's an addictive policy by the Federal Reserve, mainly because they proved over close to 15 years they couldn't stop at a zero interest rate policy. So that's why it's deemed addictive. But in an economy that is, I'm not going to use the word fragile, but is teetering right now, they're going to be very careful with that. You can't just automatically go to out of restrictive right back into easing territory right away, because that's those shocks to the systems we talk about. And honestly, it would take an extremely struggling, borderline recession economy for the Federal Reserve to do some sort of drastic cut to save the economy, if you may. So I don't see that happening, but I do see these stair steps, as I keep alluding to, of down in rate cuts, not massive cuts. But nonetheless, let's look at some things from the stagflation camp. All right. So what would make them want to cut rates massively? Well, it would take a recessionary kind of market or a recessionary kind of temperament in the economy here. So let's look at some things that people are going to point to. The savings rate in America is very low right now. Coming off of an all-time high from 2020 and 2021, we are well below the current trend line that we should be on over the last 20 plus years of the savings rate. Savings rates being money in the checking accounts, money on the sideline to use. That is well below where it needs to be. You've got the plastic usage is up in America in the form of credit card debt. It's at an all-time high. And quite frankly, that's one of those things that, in my opinion, we've been harping on this show, because that's a potential danger zone, right? When people spend more and more and more and keep debt financing it and not paying it off, keep in mind, now there's 1 in 4 Americans have a credit card, and every household has at least 4. So we're over 600 million credit cards in America. So to me, this is something that I've been tracking, and I'm not in the stagflation group, but I do agree with the credit card concept, and it's something that I've always looked at from my time in the business, doing this for 22 years. This is to me, one of the major focal points, because whenever that gets out of whack, you've got issues, because customers have to make a choice. And that choice is, well, do I pay my credit card, or do I try to fight to continue living because I'm being squeezed at multiple angles here? And, interestingly enough, some of these cutbacks that you're starting to see right now in the economy is something as simple as Starbucks. Last week Starbucks released their earnings, and by no means do I talk about stocks on here. I'm not giving investment advice, but what we do is we track warning signs, right? Could this be a tea leaf of something? And Starbucks is, as everyone on this podcast is listening, I'm sure you're aware, at some point you've either bought a Starbucks or you've been with someone that has. I mean, it ranges anywhere from $5 a cup to $8, right? Maybe even more than that. I can't tell you the last time I got a Starbucks, but I know that they're expensive, right? Well, I mean, their forecast came out and they have essentially said, listen, we expect sales to decline all of the remaining of 2024. Their forecast was to actually be a positive. That's how it started. They came in and they were severely underestimated on their earnings, and that their stores, not just nationwide, but worldwide, are suffering traffic and suffering the amount of people coming in and purchasing items in their store. To the tune in this last quarter, as I'm looking it up here, I'm talking on the podcast, trying to buy time to look it up. I believe it was close to $8.56 billion is how much their sales have dropped. Now, that's a lot. But what I look at is this, is that if you were a person that got Starbucks 3-4 times a week and you're getting it one time a week, you've cut back. And if you're a person that was getting it one time a week, you're doing it now every other week, you've cut back. You're making some sort of sacrifice I would consider Starbucks a luxury item. I mean, you don't have to have it, right? Luxury in the form of, can I afford it, and can I do away with it, and do I really need it? You know, that deems a luxury to me, not just like a high-end item. Just luxury is something that you don't have to have, but you choose to do it because you can. Well, so then my producer, Charlie, he came with a great idea. He's like, hey, go look at what's Keurig doing? And I thought this was interesting because I didn't even think of that. Keurig sales are up 25% on the quarter for a tune of $109 million. And I think that was a great pull by Charlie there, because it actually shows what we're talking about. People are, now trading off an $8 coffee or macchiato, whatever it is. And now you're getting a Keurig at home. And you're using a K-cup, right? Which is essentially anywhere from like 30 cents to $1.20 a cup. So, I mean, you're seeing those means being changed there. And a lot of that has to do with some of the data points that we keep talking about here. Wage growth is not up. It's up, but it's not up enough to match some of the issues that we're discussing here, price points being up. We're also seeing the amount of workforce hours being reduced again. So we're seeing a crunch, and the workforce is being crunched, and yet some of these prices are in some cases still going up to offset some of the costs associated with it. And you're also seeing people finance a lot of their lifestyle right now through their credit cards. And so those are recessionary warning signs. Like, any way you want to cut it, those are some big ones there. And so this also alludes to my point why I also believe there are a tremendous amount of homeowners that are sitting on just more equity than they've ever had before in their house, but they're locked into that equity. And I'm not going to go into lock-in effect again, because we've beat that drum way too much on here. But the reality is, if you've been listening to this show, there's millions of people sitting on a 4% or less, and 90% of America's 5% or less on their mortgage right now, that essentially they will debt refinance all these credit cards, and the savings rates will go up, and all of this can turn very quickly with the lowering of interest rates. Now, what happens after that? You could see a repeat of the cycle again, and that's the stagflation part of the commentary that goes into that. But I think that is one of the major things that we're going to see happen, and I think that'll happen sooner than later. I'm going to forecast in the next 12 to 18 months, you're going to see another refinance wave boom that'll clean up a lot of this credit card debt if we get those lowering of the rates before things maybe get too bad for some people. Because if you look at delinquency rates on credit cards right now, and this is all from the New York Fed, we've been talking about this too, they're continuing to go up. Matter of fact, they're at a 13-year high on delinquency rates. Now, what defines as delinquent? It's 30 days plus due. If it's due on the first and it's not paid until the following, or its default hasn't been paid all month long into the next month, that's a delinquency. But this is also a warning sign, and we actually called this on the show about 4 or 5 months ago. We said this will start to happen because there's of all the debt load you could have, installment loan, mortgage, credit card is the one that the recourse is very minimal on, in the form of recouping the items, right? If you don't pay your car note, well, that's going to get repoed. You don't pay your house, it's going to go into foreclosure. You don't pay your credit card, they're not going to come get the items that people have had to live off of, your food, your clothing, supplies. They can't come get that, right? So the delinquency rates naturally would go up before anything else. And again, mortgage delinquency rates are extremely low right now. Automobiles are extremely low, and student loan debt is starting to rise a little bit, and that was expected. But the credit card was leading the way, and it's not even close. So then that led to the next portion of the conversation when we were talking about, hey, well, are banks just going to keep extending credit to people? What are they going to do? Well, no, we talked about this in the same episode, that you're starting to see the rejection rates on credit cards go up, because the big banks that have the credit cards, they have the data, they know what's going on. So your rejection rate on applications are going up too. And that's the next sign. The next sign is when they start cutting the amount of new credit lines you can get, there may be another situation when they start cutting the current line that you have, just like what happened in 08 and 09 with credit cards. And I would not be surprised to start seeing that happen again. Matter of fact, we got a couple of viewers and listeners that already told us that's happened already in some cases, just abruptly for no reason. So I think that that's something that, we'll continue to follow on here and watch as well. So, when we talk going back to stagflation here, the other thing that I wanted to bring up was that when you think and you're of the camp that, hey, listen, this is going to continue to rear its ugly head again and come back because you cannot, if you don't get it down to the 2% target rate, that inflation is going to go back up again because you haven't got it to where it needs to get. Again, my argument to that is these things take time in the system to pan out. I mean, when the Federal Reserve raises rates, there's a lag. There's a lag it takes to work its way through the system. And we talked about that. I think Barry Habib, when he was on the show, used a great analogy of like, if you go to the doctor and the doctor prescribes you some medication and you're like, hey, a day later, nothing's happened. And the doctor says, well, it takes like a week for this medicine to kick in. But you're like, yeah, nothing happened. If the doctor keeps giving you something every single day to fix the problem, you're going to find yourself very sick. And so that's the theology of the interest rates. They take time. The hikes, the fiscal tightening, the policy takes time to go through. A lot of people, including myself, it was when I looked this up, we didn't even realize we've been in a tightening period for almost 22 months. So, I mean, in 22 months, with all those rate hikes, you're starting to see that work its way through the system in the form of that tightening and the impacts of what it's doing. And we're seeing it in the labor market. We're also seeing it in the cost market. All these things are happening, but at the same time, that inflation has come down, right? I mean, from peak to trough right now, it has come down. But the question is, it's going to have to come down significantly to reach those target numbers the Federal Reserve is wanting to achieve. And this is where the stagflation camp feels like they have a very strong argument, because as the inflation numbers are calculated, it's on a 12-month average. So the last 12 months are pretty low. And it would take even lower numbers of that to come in to lower the inflation down. But if you get just the same or even just a slight uptick, it's going to go up. And that's that counterbalance argument where stagflation says, hey, listen, we just can't shake it. It's like a bad cough I can't get rid of. And that's kind of how inflation starts to be looked at. And if you're in an inflationary cycle for a certain period, then it is considered stagflation because you haven't cured the problem, right? And I think that's going to be the topic of debate, because what defines inflation being cured? Is it a 2% number? Like, oh, we get this magical number on paper at 2%. Great, inflation's cured. Does that mean you don't see higher numbers at the grocery store still? Does that mean when you go to a restaurant, you don't see higher numbers of food costs because of labor costs? I mean, all the costs sit in there. I think, we've talked about greedflation and how that's been used as a crutch to achieve higher price points. But, the question is, when you're going to stores now, are you starting to see prices be reduced in certain areas? And I don't know that you are. I know what I am paying attention to is, and I look at these things, another trend that we'll take a look at is take a look at your fast food restaurants. They're usually the first ones to the ball game to try to cure the high priced conversation. So when you start seeing the 2 for $5s, or you start seeing the $5 meal, or you start seeing something like that out there, that is the fast food companies trying to relieve the price stress that's being put on the consumer, because they know their sales are off in certain areas. And to get them back down, they need to hit those magical combination numbers that make people feel very secure about buying that at a reasonable price. So when you start seeing that stuff, and I'm sure you are, no matter if you're watching TV, I'm starting to see them too. I even saw an IKEA commercial where IKEA was specifically speaking to the consumer and says, hey, listen, we know times are tough. We know what you once used to buy is not the same as it was today because the price is different. At IKEA, we want to maintain the same quality of service, the same high integrity in our product, but at a lower price point for you. And they're advertising all the price points around the different items they have on there. And that's another example of trying to appease, that high cost area there to get more consumers to spend. And all those things are telling me that consumers aren't spending what they once were in certain items, and that these organizations want the consumer back. It'll be very interesting to see here as we go into the second quarter here and finish up the second, going into third quarter especially. What does that start to look like? We start seeing more and more of that. But my point is this, from the stagflation camp, that it would take those prices to continue to either A, stay at a higher elevated level, or continue going up for stagflation in those scenarios to kind of rear its ugly head. When I start seeing the 2 for $5s again and IKEA doing what they're doing, to me, that tells me that price points coming down means inflation may be coming down. And that's a win, right? Now, there's always going to be sectors that are inflated. I mean, sometimes it's at the pump, sometimes it's in energy, sometimes it's in medical, motor vehicle insurance. I mean, there's a lot of things that the Federal Reserve cannot account for and cannot control. That's why they use a core reading and not the overall headline reading, because it takes out food and energy. But the reality is this. I think you're starting to see those prices come down. I think there is relief on the way to the consumer. And I think that, just like in that Starbucks example, you're probably going to pick your points, right? What I'm going to trade off versus what I'm going to get. And I think consumers will start to find better deals in the market here over the next second and third quarter. And I also think that the Federal Reserve is going to lower those interest rates, as I talked about in the previous episode, and the whole reason why. But I don't think that stagflation is on the horizon as much as the stagflation camp is. But I'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear those comments. We'll continue to put our slide decks in there. And you guys, again, if you like what you're listening, 5-star review this episode. If you would, check us out on any platform you listen to your favorite podcast on. And I just want to say thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you guys at the next episode of What's Your One More.
Got one more shot, I'm gonna make it. One more chance, I'm gonna take it. I meant it when I said it, now it's time for me to do it. I got one life to live, so I put my